What's going on, everybody? This is Mortym, and today I wanted to give kind of an overview of the combat in Divinity Original Sin 2. And the reason I wanted to do that is because this is a turn-based RPG, so the combat is a little different. So I figured what better way to do that than basically go to the middle of a town and attack everyone in it. So we're just going to click on somebody and get the combat started and basically turn the entire town against us. So, as I mentioned, Divinity Original Sin is a turn-based RPG when it comes to combat, and that essentially means, think Pokemon, actually, that's a great one. They take their turn, and then you take your turn, and then whoever's next takes their turn. The difference here compared to Pokemon being that, there's way more than one, or two, rather, combatants. So, from here, as you can see, it's my turn right now. So, right off the bat, what determines who goes first? Well, that's actually going to be your wits attribute. I went over some of the stuff in character creation. If you're a little unfamiliar with it, feel free to go look at that. If you are, however, aware of how that works, if you've played tabletop RPGs, initiative is a big thing. And that, like I said, is determined by your wits attribute. Now, when you level up, you can use this. You can use those attribute points to give you more initiative by putting them into wits, which will actually also give you critical chance. And while you're out and about in the world, it will also actually allow you to find hidden treasures. So there is that. Also detect traps. So that's what determines who gets to go first, essentially. Now, I will say putting 0 points in wits, just starting the combat usually, you wind up usually second or third. There are some different cases and scenarios in which that plays out differently. But essentially, that's the case. Now, down here, towards the bottom of the screen, all these green dots, those are our action points, which again, if you're familiar with tabletop RPGs, shouldn't be too much of a surprise to you. Now, action points are essentially exactly that, points of action, and all the abilities or movement that we use will cost action. Now, as you can see as I move my cursor, it'll tell me how many action points it would take me to move there. Now, if I were to move past someone who had an attack of opportunity, which is essentially someone that's attacking me as I'm trying to walk by them, that would actually show up as a little red sword. None of these guys, for some reason, will attack of opportunity me if I were to run past them, as that red sword circle would show up around them. Now, from here, these buttons down at the bottom, I could actually flee combat if there weren't any enemies around me, which essentially just teleports me to the nearest way shrine. And then if I just wanted to pass my turn altogether, I could just hit delay your turn, or you could just hit, end turn. That would also be fine. So from there, we have our abilities that are pretty much standard in any game. But the reason I show them to you is that top green dot is how many action points it is. So if I wanted to raise a bloated corpse, which is a necromancer skill, it would cost 1 action point. The 3 down here in the corner, that is of course the cooldown timer. So if I were to use that, it would take 3 turns to cool down. That's all pretty standard. I think that's pretty straightforward enough. If I mouse over someone, it gives me the chance to hit. Most basic attacks will cost 2 action points. Basically any melee attack will. And then you get weapon attacks, which is flurry right here. So because I'm dual wielding daggers, or dual wielding anything for that matter, I get flurry. And that actually costs 3, and that's the case with all of them. If I come over here to my other party member, Sabeel, she's using all in because she gets a 2-handed weapon, so her weapon ability is all in. That will also cost 3. So that's just pretty much how that works. Now, again, all that's pretty straightforward. If you click on any ability, it'll give you the range you can actually use it in. If I have high ground, it'll give extra area with little green pluses in it, which essentially means you're getting that extra range because you have high ground, which is a little hard to show you right here in the middle of town, mind you. But what I could try to do is if I were to come over here, it would give me extra range because I have the high ground, and essentially I can see farther. Now that's very important for characters who are using a bow, because obviously that range is going to be good. Plus, being in high ground actually gives you 20% extra damage, which again, for anything long range, wizards, archers, that's pretty important to have. From here, like I said, everything's pretty straightforward as of right now. So, of course, at the top, we see our order of attacks. It would be myself, which is at the very end here, Mortym. Then it would be the next guy, which is Magister Bella, which is probably her. Oh, no, that's Magister Carol. But we could find her, and then after that would be Sabeel, our companion over here, and then so on and so forth. That's essentially just the order of attack. Now, in this case, there's so many that it shows all of them, and you can't see anything else. But this white bar here is actually the end of turn. Anything past that is actually just the turn starting over, and that lets you know who's next, in which case would probably be me, but I can't guarantee that. It would take into initiative at that point. That is the basics of how jumping into combat works. Now, if I were sneaking or something, that would obviously affect it differently, because if I were to attack someone from sneaking, depending on if that attack breaks sneak or if they saw me to begin with, that would be a totally different thing. But from there, I'm just going to hit this guy and we'll move on a little bit. Now, I'm dual-wielding daggers, which means they get a backstab critical on whoever I happen to hit. Now, because they shouldn't get anything, if I hover over them, that little white circle or triangle behind them is where I would get backstab criticals from. So I'm going to jump over here real fast, and then, as you can see, it goes pretty well. Random civilians have, like, no health, so, you know, you're pretty much decimating them. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is that a bunch of attacks here have extra effects. Now, if we look at Magister Carol, you can see on her health bar that pops up that there's two other bars above that. Now, the white one is physical armor, and the blue one is magic armor. Now, in order to hit her vitality, I have to break through one of those two things with the associated type. Now, physical armor is obviously pretty straightforward. Basically, most physical damage attacks, all of your weapon, if you look at an ability, it'll actually tell you what it is resisted by. Necromancers do physical damage, so most of their stuff is actually resisted by physical armor. Whereas if I come over to Sabeel here, I believe she has one that's... No, she doesn't actually. But if I were to be using any magic attack, it would say that it's resisted by magic armor as opposed to physical armor. Now, there are certain abilities, such as Sawtooth Knife here, for instance, that do piercing damage, which essentially just ignores their armor entirely and goes straight into their health. Again, not too high of a concept, but it's important to know. Now, why have that at all? So, they're not just extra health bars. What those two things also do is actually prevent status effects. So, if I come over here and I look at, let's say... Yeah, actually, Sawtooth Knife, I believe. So, if I were to use Sawtooth Knife on an enemy that has no physical armor, it's guaranteed to bleed them. Now, if I come over here to Sabeel, I can see that if I look at this one, it actually knocks down enemy characters in the range and does physical damage. And coincidentally enough, actually clears surfaces, which we'll get into here in just a minute. Which is important because it will only set knockdown if the target has no physical armor. So we're going to go ahead and finish up Mortym's turn and then let it play out a little bit. And we'll just end turn here. So it's then Magister Bella's turn, who then uses that to run up and hit Sabeel with an attack. And now it's Sabeel's turn. So what we're going to do with her is run up a little bit. And then we're going to use, I believe it's Ground Stomp? Battle Stomp. And we're going to hit all four of these people with Battle Stomp. Now, we killed Ada Laird, and our weapon actually prevented Tilia Snook from getting knocked down because our weapon has a chance to set atrophy, which hit instead. And essentially atrophy means you can't attack or anything. Now, Magister Carol over here didn't get knocked down because, as you can see, I didn't eat through all of her physical armor, which resists those status effects. Now, if I charge to them, which is our Battering Ram ability, which again, it shows me all the places I could rush to. I can rush directly to her, or I can rush past her, whatever floats your boat when you pick that one. But if I were to rush to her, it sets knockdown on both of them because it still has atrophy, but it didn't have to fight with it. But as you can see, Carol's knocked down now because all of her physical armor was gone. Which again, pretty straightforward. So, the only other thing that I really wanted to show you guys as far as the combat overview goes, is the different things that you can do with effects. And what I mean by that, I actually have to load another game to show you real quick, so we're gonna restart this over again. Okay, so here we are in Driftwood Square again. Now this time I've switched out a few abilities for Rain and Shocking Touch. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and attack our random towns member again, getting combat started. Magister Bella here goes first, and then it'll be my turn after that, and then I'll show you some of the other things. Now, there are a variety of effects in this game, and this is actually where things get a little more complicated. Up to this point, it's all been pretty straightforward. If you've played any game, really, you can pretty much get a handle on those things. Now, from here, we're going to cast Rain, and this is going to cast a spreading water surface. Now, essentially what that's going to do is it's going to cast wet on everything that it's actually, in the rain, which makes sense, of course, but it's also going to put water on the ground, which is, of course, what rain does. But I'm being over-the-top explanatory because of what we're about to do next. Now, as you can see, if I hover over that water, it says it can be electrified or frozen. If I hover over these people, you can see that they are, in fact, wet, which applies different status effects to their resistances. Now, from here, I'm using an ability called Shocking Touch. So, I'm going to shock our friend Rowan Cantrelli. So, I just stunned him. Now, if I were to use Shocking Touch by itself, it would just set Shocking, and then if I were to use another shock attack, it would actually stun him after that. But because he was already wet from the rain, or any wet surface, mind you, if I look at Electrified Blood, I set Electrified to it because it's a wet surface. Now, if I were to try to walk through an electrified surface consistently, or over more than a few steps, it would set Shocked, and then I would suddenly be stunned because I'm trying to walk through electric damage, essentially. There's a bunch of stuff like that. There are fire damage. There is a Cursed and Blessed effect that you can give to all of these surfaces, which have different effects, of course, which apply essentially different status effects that can't be cured through normal means a lot of the times, which adds a lot of depth to it. In addition to water, there's also just straight up burning surfaces, there's electrified surfaces, there are frozen surfaces, you can do cursed fire, you can do cursed water, which applies chilled and other things that cannot be removed by status effect removing stuff while you're inside of it. Now it is worth noting that magic armor, in most cases mind you, will still do, will actually keep you from taking most of that damage. See, if I move over here, I took damage to my magic armor, but I wasn't set with Shocked because I wasn't shocked. Because essentially it hit my magic armor rather than hitting me. So I still have to burn through that for those status effects to come into play. And that's definitely going to be the basic overview of how this stuff works. Turn-based, so you gotta kind of play around that a little bit. But for the most part, it's still really fun to me. So you combine all of those area of effect attacks, and then you add in all of these skills and stuff. For instance, I have a Bloodsucker here. If I were to come over here to that blood surface, which I'll actually go ahead and do just to show you. Because I'm using Bloodsucker here, I can actually use that particular skill to suck up all of that blood in the area, which in that particular case gives me extra health back. But there's all sorts of abilities like that that play on the effects that are currently going on. And when you get into the higher difficulties, something you really have to pay a lot of attention to is where your character is standing in relation to those things, because just because you're the person who casts the spell does not mean you are immune to its effects on a surface. So if I were to cast a lightning bolt onto an electric surface, or a water surface that I'm standing in, my character will also be stunned. And that applies to all the difficulty levels. So there are really things you gotta watch out for, and as you get used to it, it becomes a little easier to do, like most things, of course. But the combat system, even though it's turn-based, which will certainly bother a lot of people, is still really in-depth just because of all of these different surface changes. It's actually worth noting that Battle Stomp will actually clear a lot of them. See, it actually cleared up most of those water puddles right there. But the problem with rain is that a lot of times it'll wind up spreading back. However, so it's important to note that if you're playing this game sincerely, that managing your environment is actually a crucial part of that, especially on Tactician mode, which is the highest difficulty mode, short of Honor mode, which just gives you a single save to work with. But again, managing that stuff is all important, and at lower difficulty levels it can just be advantageous to you, for obvious reasons, of course. So that's pretty much going to wrap up my overview of combat in Divinity Original Sin 2. I certainly hope you guys enjoyed it. Combining the turn-based system with all of these different effects and then all of the abilities which change and manipulate the environment as well as your enemies, or yourselves in a lot of cases if you don't pay that much attention, it's just a really in-depth combat system, like surprisingly so, because this is just the direct combat system. This isn't taking into effect all of the other things you can do, like sneak around and pickpocket and how those things can affect combat. How I can split party members and actually put one in sneak mode, for instance, and have her join combat at a later point than a second person, or a third or fourth actually, is actually as big as the party as you can make yourself get. So there's just a lot of options to it. It's, again, surprisingly in-depth. However, the purpose of this video was basically just to give a basic introduction, which I certainly hope I've done. Now, if you enjoyed the video, I certainly hope you subscribe and stick around. I'll be putting up a video about all the various talents you can pick, which, again, if you're unfamiliar with, you can check out my in-depth character creation video, which will explain talents a little bit. But I will go over pretty much all of these in a video that I will be putting up next, which is why I mentioned it. Now from here, I just hope you guys have a good day. So, have a good one.